Welcome back to Ray University 302, the Harlem Renaissance, and we're in Unit 2, Ideology, Identity, and Power. Now that we understand how Harlem became a Black cultural center, we need to ask a harder question. Who controlled Black representation during the Harlem Renaissance, and why did that control matter? To answer that, we have to talk about W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois grew up definitely the most Black Americans of his time. Born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts in 1868, he came of age in a largely white, non-formally segregated northern town and gained early access to elite education and institutions. He was not shaped by the Jim Crow South in the way that most Black Americans were. That background matters. It shaped how Du Bois understood progress, leadership, and respectability. He believed that education, refinement, and visibility could force white America to recognize Black community. That belief informed one of his most influential and controversial ideas, the talented tip. Du Bois argued that cultivating a highly educated Black elite would uplift the race as a whole. Leadership in this model flowed from the top down, driven by intellectual and moral authority rather than collective action. In short, excellence would trickle down and benefit the collective, or as I like to call it, trickle-down economics. This elitist leadership model conflicted with a lot of other Black visionaries at the time, including Booker T. Washington's vocational uplift and Marcus Garvey's mass-based Black nationalism. At its core, it was a class conflict. Who should direct Black progress, the educated elite or the Black masses? Out of this tension came Du Bois' most enduring concept, double consciousness. Introduced in the souls of Black folks, it describes the experience of seeing oneself in two ways at once: who you know yourself to be and who a hostile society insists you are. For Black elites, double consciousness meant constant surveillance, forced representation, and the pressure to perform excellence. Respectability became both a strategy and a trap. This is where culture stops being expression and becomes responsibility. If Black artists were always representing the race, the question becomes, who decided what good representation looked like? In many ways, that answer was Du Bois himself. As a founder of the NAACP and editor of The Crisis, Du Bois didn't just theorize culture, he built infrastructure. Du Bois' platform, Harlem Renaissance Artists, shaped which forms of Black culture were elevated and helped define what Black modernism looked like on a national stage. As a cultural gatekeeper, Du Bois elevated what he viewed as disciplined and refined art, reframing it as Black modernism, while rejecting forms he believed reinforced white supremacy or diverted attention from the struggle. Over time, Du Bois confronted a hard reality. Education did not protect Black people from violence, exploitation, or political repression. By the late 1920s, Black excellence was visible, Black culture was celebrated, and material conditions barely changed. That realization reshaped his politics. In his later years, Du Bois aligned himself with socialist critiques of capitalism, embraced Pan-Africanism, and argued that freedom required independent Black institutions, not just access to white ones. Education alone, he concluded, could not deliver liberation. Under Cold War surveillance and political repression, Du Bois eventually left the United States. He spent his final years in Ghana at the invitation of the president, where he died in 1963. The Harlem Renaissance was burdened with expectation. Black artists weren't just creating, they were representing. And representation came with rules. Du Bois believed that culture carried responsibility. Representation, respectability, and elite leadership were strategies he believed could protect Black people under white scrutiny. But they also imposed limits. Before next lecture, sit with and leave your answer to the reflection question in the comments. When culture is deliberately used as a vehicle for racial advancement, who gains the authority to define its purpose? And how does class and power decide what kinds of Black expression is considered legitimate? Next, we'll examine the new Negro debate and the ideological conflict shaping Black modern identity. I'll see you next lecture. In last lecture, we looked at Du Bois as a cultural gatekeeper and how representation, respectability, and leadership shaped who was elevated during the Harlem Renaissance. Today's lecture builds directly from that, because once Black culture became visible at scale, it raised a new question. What kinds of Blackness was supposed to represent the race? And the Harlem Renaissance becomes complicated because the answer was never singular. By the mid-1920s, many agreed that something had changed in Black life. That shift was called the New Negro. The old Negro, framed as humble, meek, and survival-focused, was something to move beyond. But what should replace it was deeply contested. Within 50 years of enslavement, when Black people were legally barred from literacy, Black writers and artists stood at the forefront of global literary modernism. Art became freedom, protest, evidence of humanity, and a challenge to the status quo. But the Harlem Renaissance was not just one movement with one ideology, it was a site of debate. Two of the most influential frameworks that shaped this debate came from Alain Locke, who is often referred to as the father of the Harlem Renaissance, and Du Bois. The New Negro didn't emerge from a single event. It emerged because several forces collided at once. Firstly, between 1915 and 1930, millions of Black Americans migrated north, leaving rural isolation for concentrated, visible urban centers. Urban life created Black newspapers and political organizations, clubs, salons, rent parties, and debate, and a shared public culture. You cannot imagine the New Negro without cities. Density produced identity. Secondly, World War I intensified this shift. Black men fought abroad, experienced less overt racism, and returned home to segregation and violence. The question changed from when will freedom come to why doesn't it exist now? Older strategies felt exhausted, accommodation hadn't worked, and legal appeals felt too slow. Violence continued anyway. Finally, by the 1920s, Black institutions finally had scale. national magazines, publishing pipelines, patrons, and colleges producing Black artists and critics. For the first time, Black culture could define itself publicly and nationally. This wasn't just political, it was psychological. Against double consciousness, the new Negro declared, we will assert identity, we will experiment, and we will contradict ourselves in public. The new Negro wasn't asking to be included, it was announcing itself. Locke and Du Bois I wouldn't describe as opposites, but competing centers of gravity. Alan Locke's most influential contribution to the Harlem Renaissance was editing The New Negro, an anthology of poetry, fiction, essays, and visual art that framed the Harlem Renaissance as a coherent cultural movement. In it, Locke argued that Black Americans were entering a new phase of self-definition. For Locke, culture itself was political, visibility was power, and Black art and Black life were inherently beautiful, and when made visible through cultural production, they could challenge white assumptions about Black humanity. Freedom, in his view, emerged through expression rather than restraint. Artistic experimentation signaled modernity and cultural maturity. Pluralism mattered. There was no single way to be Black. Folk culture, refinement, pleasure, and modernism could coexist, and Black expression did not require discipline or policing to be legitimate. Du Bois did not disagree that culture mattered. He disagreed about how much risk Black people could afford. Du Bois believed that Black art circulated in a hostile white society. Black art would be judged as evidence of the race, and representation carried collective consequences. When Du Bois criticized work as vulgar or too radical, he wasn't rejecting Black culture. He was rejecting what he believed white power would weaponize. Du Bois once said, all art is propaganda and ever must be, meaning art should advance liberation, educate, mobilize, and serve clear racial goals. For Du Bois, political was not expressive, it was not pleasurable, it was strategic, moral, and disciplined. And this was not about taste, it was about survival under scrutiny. I'll also add that Du Bois believed that Black people should not depend on white people to support Black art, and that Black people should be supporting Black art. Because when you depend on white dollars to support Black art, it skews the messaging and it sanitizes it, and it loses its value. So while he thought Black people could police Black art, he didn't think white people should. He ran a strict program. He was not giving invitations to the cookout. Both believed art could move the race forward, but they disagreed on whether it should be curated or plural, disciplined or emergent, strategic or expressive. This is the core tension of the Harlem Renaissance. Some wanted it to be managed, curated, and intentional, and some wanted culture to be liberated, unapologetic, and expressive. And crucially, these were not abstract debates. These competing visions shaped who got published, who received patronage, which artists were elevated or sidelined, and why blues, jazz, sexuality, and folk speech were constantly contested. As we'll learn, the Harlem Renaissance often looks fractured, and that's because it was. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't a single ideology. It was a collision of competing ideas about modernity, culture, power, and identity. That's not a failure. That's what makes something a renaissance. I mean, Leonardo and Michelangelo had beef too. The Harlem Renaissance was not a monolith. It was a collision of competing ideas about culture, power, and identity. You'll see in this course, the new Negro was not one idea, it was a battlefield. Before our next lecture, sit with this reflection question and leave your answer in the comments. How did a cultural movement born in a segregated neighborhood at the top of Manhattan become a global story? Next lecture will follow this thread directly because it turns out the new Negro had the same problem. Niggas trying to stick him for his paper. I'll see you next lecture. And today's central claim is funding is not neutral because the Harlem Renaissance didn't exist outside of capitalism. It existed within it. And old Negro, new Negro, red Negro, blue Negro, everybody was trying to get paid because at the end of the day, rent was due. And for a brief period, the Harlem Renaissance did create the conditions needed for artists to actually sustain themselves with their work. So the question becomes, who financed Black culture's rise, and what did that financial support require in return? The economics of the Harlem Renaissance included a often glossed over underbelly illegality. Prohibition turned Harlem's nightlife into a cash economy. Speakeasies, after-hours clubs, rent parties, gambling, sex work, and queer nightlife that was unusually visible all circulated money throughout Harlem. That visibility brought income, but it also brought raids, surveillance, and morality policing. Black residents absorbed most of the risk. Meanwhile, white visitors could come uptown, consume the thrill, and leave. Think hoodlum, bootlegging, nightlife, mob control, and police corruption. This matters because Harlem's culture was already profitable before institutions arrived to legitimize it. The underground economy made culture visible, but it also made Harlem dangerous and heavily policed. It set the stage for the next, less cinematic but equally powerful figure in this story, the white patron. Much of the Harlem Renaissance depended on white patrons. They paid rent, funded publications, and opened access to presses, stages, and national audiences. But support came with conditions. Funding favored work that was refined, non-confrontational, and safe for white audiences. Artists understood these constraints clearly. In Infants of the Spring, Wallace Thurman captured this bluntly. He wrote, "They wanted to be artists, but they also wanted to eat." Patronage made careers possible, but it also shaped outcomes, influencing what was publishable, fundable, palatable, and remembered. And patronage opened doors, but it narrowed the hallway. Artists were rarely choosing between freedom and money. They were choosing between survival with conditions or integrity without protection. Different choices, same structural trap. And when profits fell or taste shifted, support disappeared. Now, Harlem's rise was not accidental. It coincided with the expansion of mass media and publishing in New York City. Harlem moved from a local treasure to a global phenomenon. Black culture circulated through Black newspapers, white-owned publishing houses, nightclubs, touring circuits, and elite word-of-mouth networks. Because Harlem sat inside of Manhattan, artists could move between the Black community life and white-controlled media industries, and white elites could scout and return back downtown. Harlem became visible not only because of cultural brilliance, but because it was market accessible. It was embedded in an infrastructure that allowed Black culture to circulate nationally and internationally. But that visibility came at a cost. Harlem became a destination where white audiences consumed Black culture as a spectacle. In passing, Nella Larson captures this unease, depicting Harlem nightlife as something observed rather than shared. Harlem became both a sanctuary and a spectacle, where Black life generated money and scrutiny at the same time. The economics of the Harlem Renaissance was deeply uneven. Writers sometimes secured publishing contracts or patronage, but advances were small, royalties were unreliable, and approval was conditional. Performers faced greater precarity. Musicians and dancers worked nightly, were paid per performance, and lacked long-term security. Venues like the Cotton Club made this imbalance explicit. Black performers, white audiences, white ownership, profits flowing outward. Black talent generated wealth, but it rarely controlled it. By the 1930s, the glamour of the Harlem Renaissance faded as economic support collapsed. Artists continued to create, but culture alone could not shield them from material reality. Patrons withdrew, clubs closed, and publications folded. Some writers and performers died broke or burned out. Others turned to teaching, journalism, government arts programs, or survival work. This is why W.E.B. Du Bois argued that dependence on white institutions distorted truth and left Black artists vulnerable. Black culture was elevated and briefly well-funded, but that did not liberate its creators. Control over money and institutions remained elsewhere. The pattern is clear. Black creativity is welcome when profitable, managed while visible, and abandoned when inconvenient. Money powered the Harlem Renaissance, but control of that money never belongs to the people who made the culture. Before our next lecture, sit with our reflection question and leave a response in the comments. Does culture have power without economic progress? And when culture becomes commodified, even for survival, does it lose its meaning? See you next lecture. And in our last lecture, we examined money. Who funded the Renaissance? Who profited? And who remained economically vulnerable? As we close Unit 2 and prepare to move into the artists themselves, we move from money to infrastructure because art doesn't circulate on talent alone. It circulates through systems. This lecture asks, who built the structures that determined which Black artists were legitimized, which were preserved, and which were quietly filtered out? Legacies are created and endure not merely because of artistic talent, but because institutions decide what is worth elevating and archiving. Gatekeeping, respectability, and institutional access were central to the Harlem Renaissance and its artists' legacies. The Harlem Renaissance did not simply emerge from rent parties and nightclubs. It was assembled, curated, funded, and strategically introduced to the public. Editors, administrators, philanthropists, and cultural organizations brought assumptions about which forms of Black expression were acceptable and which bodies were respectable when presenting Black modernism. Behind every celebrated writer or performer stood invisible labor: manuscript editing, contest judging, fundraising, invitation networks, shaping access and visibility. Infrastructure did not just support art, it structured it. At the heart of the Harlem Renaissance was an unspoken rule. If Black culture was going to circulate nationally, it had to appear respectable and controlled. Polished language, political caution, sexual restraint, and distance from poverty in rural life. This was not simply an aesthetic preference, it was risk management. White money was involved, white institutions were watching, and Black elites wanted access. The NAACP and its publication, The Crisis, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, became powerful engines of circulation. The magazine did more than publish art. Reflecting middle-class respectability politics, it helped define what Black excellence and modernism should look like. Similarly, Opportunity, published by the National Urban League, hosted literary contests and well-known opportunity dinners. Those spaces were influential, but not democratic. They awarded work that was modern, yet controlled, experimental, yet palatable, and Black, but not too Black. Elite spaces shaped by respectability politics often favored lighter-skinned artists and those aligned with middle-class norms, while blues culture, vernacular speech, rural influence, overt sexuality, and darker skin was treated as risky. Harlem salons, literary circles, and invitation-only networks, including blue vein societies, reinforced color hierarchies and class boundaries. This was a strategic gatekeeping that determined access. Some prominent Black stewards included Jesse Redmond Faust, literary editor at The Crisis, who built the Renaissance's literary backbone through editing and mentorship; Charles S. Johnson, editor of Opportunity, who bridged artists and white philanthropists; A. Philip Randolph, owner of The Messenger, which modeled a more radical alternative, centering class struggle and Black labor politics. White patronage intensified the filtering. Patrons did not simply fund artists, they shaped them. Money came with expectations, moral discipline, political restraint, aesthetic compliance. Artists who conformed often sustained longer careers. Those who resisted faced sharper consequences. Freedom collided with funding. White patron Charlotte Osgood Mason financed Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Alan Locke, providing stipends while demanding control over their output. Carl Van Vechten helped open doors to white publishers and audiences, yet his influence often reinforced the white gaze by exoticizing Black life. In the Cotton Club, the imbalance between Black performers and white employers was visible. It showcased brilliant talent and paid well compared to many other venues, launching the careers of Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway. But Black audiences were excluded, white patrons filled the room, and white owners took the profits, and lighter-skinned performers were preferred. That was an uplift, that was extraction. Respectability was framed as protection, but it functioned as a gate, and white patronage and institutional support were framed as opportunity, yet preserved white control while extracting Black culture. Colorism was not merely personal bias, it was economic sorting. The Harlem Renaissance makes this clear. Black culture could be celebrated and commodified without Black people gaining power over ownership, narrative, or legacy. This pattern, celebration without protection, profit without power, and visibility without access, continues to shape Black cultural life and creativity today. This week, we've seen the Harlem Renaissance was shaped not just by talent, but by systems and institutions that elevated some voices and constrained others. Before our next lecture, sit with our reflection question and leave your answer in the comments. If culture cannot circulate without systems, and systems hold power, how should we interpret artistic success during the Harlem Renaissance? Whose legacy, in your opinion, do you believe was most effectively preserved by gatekeeping structures? Next, in Unit 3, People, Performance, and Infrastructure, we'll trace individual lives to see how economic pressure, political constraint, and racial scrutiny shape not only artistic output, but survival and deeply unequal outcomes. These uneven outcomes shaped who was preserved, who was protected, and who had to be rediscovered decades later. Because culture doesn't exist in the abstract. It lives in bodies, careers, and material conditions. I'll see you next lecture. Welcome back to Reagan University 302, the Harlem Renaissance office hours. And by the end of this course, you should be able to answer our capstone question, which is, to what extent did the Harlem Renaissance succeed and fail as a strategy for Black freedom? And today we'll walk through the Unit 2 reflection questions. And if you can answer all of these reflection questions from Unit 2 and every other unit clearly, you should have the foundation for your capstone answer. Let's jump in. Lecture 5's reflection question was, when culture is deliberately used as a vehicle for racial advancement, who gains the authority to define its purpose? And how does class and power decide what kinds of Black expression are considered legitimate? My answer was, once culture becomes a strategy, it becomes tied to economic survival. Authority shifts to those who control access: editors, publishers, patrons, and elite leadership. Even liberation required approval. Class and color shaped what counted as good representation. Respectable, refined work was elevated, while expression seen as too rural, sexual, queer, or confrontational was often filtered out. Culture was no longer just expression. It was curated, and whoever controlled the curation controlled the culture. Lecture 6. How did a cultural movement born in a segregated neighborhood at the top of Manhattan become a global story? My answer. Harlem became global not just because it was brilliant, but because it was strategically positioned inside Manhattan, the publishing and media capital of the United States. Black newspapers circulated locally, while white-owned publishing houses distributed nationally. Nightlife drew white elites uptown who carried Harlem back into their networks. Harlem was segregated, but not isolated. It was embedded in infrastructure. Lecture 7. Does culture have power without economic progress? And when culture becomes commodified, even for survival, does it lose its meaning? My answer was, culture absolutely has symbolic power. The Harlem Renaissance reshaped how Black life was imagined. It created new aesthetics, new intellectual frameworks, and new pride. But symbolic power is not material change. Economic control largely remained outside of Black hands, so visibility did not guarantee ownership or institutional power. Commodification alone isn't the issue. Artists had to survive. The real question is, who controls the profit and who absorbs the risk? The Harlem Renaissance shows that culture can shift perception, but without economic progress, it struggles to shift power. Lecture 8. If culture cannot circulate without systems and systems hold power, how should we interpret artistic success during the Harlem Renaissance? Whose legacy, in your opinion, do you believe was most effectively preserved by those cultural gatekeeping structures? My answer was, success was never purely merit-based. It was shaped and filtered through publishers, patrons, and institutions. This doesn't diminish talent, but it reminds us that visibility is structured, and legacies aligned with respectability were more easily preserved than those with radical voices. When we look at who is most widely remembered, we're seeing not just brilliance, but which artists fit the systems preserving them. A reminder that preservation is political. In my view, Langston Hughes and Duke Ellington have among the strongest preserved legacies, often positioned as the faces of the Harlem Renaissance because their sanitized images translated well across institutional platforms. And those are all my answers. Unit 2 has shown us that the Harlem Renaissance was not just about art, it was about power. Who defines it and who funds it? Who circulates it and who preserves it? As we move towards our capstone lecture, keep asking who ultimately controls the terms of success. This is our office hours. It is over. I'm hoping you guys are enjoying this casual setting, and I'll see you next unit.